It happened a few years back when I was 16, a sophomore in high school. It felt like just another Friday night in November in my quiet neighborhood in Indiana. I live near the edge of the countryside, with a dense forest and, further on, a field across from my house. I should mention that there weren't many houses around, and most of my friends didn't live nearby. On my left was an elderly couple who usually had family over on weekends, but that night their house was quiet. To my right, there was a middle-aged couple, but they were away working their usual night shifts. Finally, across and far down to the left of my house was a friendly couple with a sweet 5-year-old who always loved to come over and play with me and my 10-year-old brother. My parents decided to go out for the evening, and they usually stayed out late into the night when they did. My brother was spending the night at a friend's house. I felt tired that evening, so I decided to stay home and enjoy a relaxing night while snow started to fall. The night was mostly uneventful, filled with some TV early on and then some Xbox later. I remember having some pasta and chicken, but I should note that I didn't drink or take any substances that night, so I knew what happened next was real. The clock had just struck 11 p.m. when I was deep into a game of Halo, and I suddenly felt that something was off. I brushed it off, thinking it was just that weird feeling you get when you're alone. But just as I started to forget about it, I heard it. Smack, smack, smack. Fear gripped me as I realized that sound wasn't coming from me or the TV. It was louder and clearer than anything that could have come from the game. I turned pale as I realized it came from the window right above the couch. And me. I quickly turned around and lifted the blinds to see no one. Nothing unusual. The snow was falling, and everything looked disturbingly normal. Oh, I thought, maybe it was just rocks blown by the wind, or maybe snow or ice falling from the roof. Despite trying to reassure myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong and that whatever hit that window wasn't an accident. I decided to calm my nerves by heading into the office to play games or watch something on the computer. Anything to take my mind off it. For about 30 minutes, it worked. I told myself I was just being silly and should enjoy the time alone. Then, about 35 minutes later, there came another sound. Womp, womp, womp. This time it came from the window to my right in the office. I felt sick. I knew then that this wasn't just a coincidence, and it wasn't the weather or an animal. It was too consistent, too deliberate. I immediately ran to the kitchen and grabbed the family flashlight and a large knife. One for checking things out, the other for defense if my gut feeling was right. I ran back and shined the flashlight out the window into the yard and the forest. I didn't see anything, except what looked like light footprints leading from the window to the forest in the thin layer of snow on the ground. My mind raced with possibilities. I had never felt this much fear in my life. I called my mom, hoping she would answer. When I finally reached her, I told her what had happened. She spoke in a hopeful yet serious tone. "Lock the doors. If it happens again, call the police. Stay safe." My parents were about an hour away, and they offered to come home, but I refused, not wanting to ruin their night. I went to each door and locked them, to each window, and then up to my room with my phone, the knife, and the flashlight. I still didn't fully believe it could be real, so I put on some music and tried to fall asleep, hoping to wake up and realize it was all just my imagination. I was listening to music and nearly asleep when I thought I heard something in the completely quiet house. I took my earbuds out to hear a new sound. Whack, whack, whack. With each hit, my heart sank more. After a few moments, it stopped, but I was too scared to move from my bed. I called my parents again. Within 45 minutes, they were home, and thankfully, there were no further incidents. By then, it was around 3 a.m. I told them everything I could remember and showed them what I had seen. The three of us searched the outside of the house, with my dad carrying his handgun in case we found anything. Once again, nothing was found, except for deep footprints in the now several inches of snow. These prints circled the house several times, stopping in front of the windows and the side door, which, upon closer inspection, had a dent in the center, as if something heavy had hit it. We stayed up until morning, and then my dad decided to follow the tracks into the forest to see where they led. When he came back, he told us that the tracks led to a small shelter where he found several photographs of our house and a small sledgehammer with wood splinters stuck on it. The tracks then led to a road far across the field. After that night, I didn't stay in the house alone at night for years. This story happened when I was 21 years old. I had just returned home from a late shift stocking shelves at the nearby supermarket. I usually got off work around midnight since I worked the closing shift. I lived in a low-budget apartment with my roommate, Steve. We didn't live in the best neighborhood, but I was just grateful to have a place of my own instead of crashing at my parents' house. I tossed my jacket on the hook near the front door and headed to the kitchen to search for a snack. I had just grabbed a frozen pizza from the freezer when I noticed something odd. My bedroom door was slightly ajar as I walked past the hallway. This might not seem strange at first, but I distinctly remembered closing it that morning before heading to work. I value my privacy, so I always make sure to shut my door when I leave. I stepped back into the living room and glanced down the hall. "Hello," I called out. There was only silence. Not wanting to let my nerves get to me, I walked across the living room and flicked on the hallway light switch. "Steve, is that you?" I asked. Steve was always a bit quirky, so I figured maybe he was trying to pull some kind of prank on me. Maybe he was waiting to jump out of my closet when I entered my room. When I reached the bedroom door, I slowly pushed it open. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, lighting up a good portion of it. I looked around, definitely feeling uneasy. The room was empty, and everything seemed normal. Just my usual stuff, my twin bed with a nightstand on the left. I shut the door and went back to the kitchen. I put my dinner in the microwave and hit the start button. While it was heating up, I turned on the TV, ready to put on a scary movie and unwind. Suddenly, I heard a dull thud coming from down the hall. At first, I thought it was just the neighbors. They could be pretty noisy, and it wasn't uncommon to hear a loud bang at night. But then it happened again, and this time I was sure it was coming from down the hall. "Steve," I called out again. Just then, the microwave beeped, making me jump. "Yeah, sorry. I dropped something," I heard him say through the door. I'll admit, I felt a bit relieved knowing Steve was home. I walked back to the kitchen to grab my food, and that's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Steve. "Hey man, I'm running late at work. Could you leave the door unlocked for me?" My heart sank, and a chill shot down my spine. I texted back, "Wait, you're still at work?" He replied a few seconds later, "Yeah, why?" At that moment, another sound came from the hallway, and I looked up. The silhouette of a tall man was standing there, holding what looked like a large knife. I bolted for the front door, hearing the heavy thud of the man's boots behind me. He wasn't running, more like he was walking slowly, deliberately. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the emergency stairs and out into the parking lot where I called the police. I was 13. It was a typical evening, around 8:30 p.m. My younger cousin and I were at his place because I was babysitting while my mom and aunt were out shopping, and my dad and uncle were at a movie. We were just sitting there, and I started to feel really uneasy. Something felt off, but I couldn't figure out what it was. So I just kept watching TV with my cousin. The uneasy feeling didn't go away, so I got up and went to lock the back door. When I came back through the kitchen, I saw what was making me feel so strange. In the window, there was an old, rough-looking man, staring inside at my cousin. My instincts kicked in. I acted like I didn't notice the guy and told my cousin we should go upstairs since our parents would be home soon, and they wouldn't want him staying up late. So, I went upstairs and put him to bed, fully aware that there was a man outside who wanted to get in. At the time, I was about 130 pounds and 5 feet 7 inches, and I played football for my school. If I recall correctly, I went back downstairs to the kitchen and grabbed a meat tenderizing hammer. When I turned back to the window, he wasn't there anymore. I rushed to the front door and made sure both the deadbolt and the knob were locked. Then, I hurried back upstairs with the meat tenderizer and went into my cousin's room, sitting down in front of the door. He asked what I was doing, and I told him not to worry and to keep his head down. I called the police and then my dad and uncle. The police said they'd take about 30 minutes, and my dad and uncle were 40 minutes away. That's when I heard a window shatter and the sound of heavy boots walking around downstairs. I told my cousin to stay calm, hide under the covers, and keep quiet. I could hear the guy moving around on the main floor. It was terrifying. I gripped that meat tenderizer and waited. About 5 minutes later, I heard the boots coming up the stairs. At this point, my heart was racing. My cousin's door was only about 10 feet from the stairs. I heard him open the doors to my aunt and uncle's room, then the bathroom. Then he went back downstairs, and I heard him open the basement door. About 15 minutes later, the police arrived and stormed into the house. It turned out the man had escaped from a mental institution in a neighboring state. I was staying at my grandmother's house for the weekend. It was an old, creaky place on a quiet street where everyone kept to themselves. She loved the calm, but it always made me feel uneasy. The house had a way of making you feel like you were being watched, even when you were alone. On Saturday evening, it started. My grandmother had gone to bed early as usual, leaving me downstairs to watch TV. I sat on the couch with the only light coming from the flickering screen. The house was eerily quiet except for the occasional groan of the old floorboards. As the hours passed, I began to feel more and more uneasy. Something felt off. The usual background noises, the ticking clock and the hum of the fridge, sounded distant, like they were being muffled by something else, something more frightening. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible creak coming from the kitchen. I froze, my eyes darting to the dark doorway that led to the kitchen. The sound was faint, but it made my skin crawl. I stayed still, listening, my heart racing. A few seconds later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, like someone was carefully stepping on the floorboards, testing each step. I didn't want to believe it, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was in the kitchen. My mind tried to reason it away, thinking it was just the house settling. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps were too deliberate, too human. I sat there, paralyzed with fear, as the sound grew closer. Whoever it was, they were coming towards the living room. I couldn't stay there any longer. I quietly slipped off the couch, trying not to make a sound, and crept towards the stairs. My only thought was getting to my grandmother. She was old and fragile. If there was someone in the house, she wouldn't be able to defend herself. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard the footsteps stop. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare look back. Instead, I raced up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my feet barely touching the steps. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. When I reached the top, I glanced over my shoulder. The doorway at the bottom of the stairs was empty, but that didn't ease my fear. I knew someone was still downstairs, and they knew I was up here. I rushed to my grandmother's room and found her asleep, unaware of the danger. I gently shook her, but she didn't wake. She was on medication that made her sleep deeply, so waking her up was impossible. I stood there, torn between staying with her or hiding somewhere else. Then, I heard the creaking again, this time on the stairs. They were coming up. I couldn't think straight. My body moved on its own as I slipped into the closet, pulling the door just slightly open to see through the crack. I crouched there, barely breathing, as the footsteps drew nearer. The creaking stopped outside the room. I could see a shadow under the door, long and still. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening. I prayed they wouldn't come in, that they'd leave, but the door handle slowly turned. The door opened with a soft click, and I held my breath. I could only see their feet, worn, dirty boots, standing in the doorway. The figure didn't move, just stood there, as if deciding what to do next. After what felt like hours, the figure finally stepped into the room. I watched as they moved slowly, cautiously, towards my grandmother's bed. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I couldn't make a sound. I could only watch in horror as they stood over her. But they didn't do anything. They just stood there watching her sleep. I could see the outline of their body, but it was too dark to make out any details. Then, as quietly as they had come in, they turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind them. I stayed hidden for what felt like forever, too scared to move. When I was finally sure they were gone, I crept out of the closet and checked on my grandmother. She was still asleep, unaware of the intruder. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door, listening for any sign that they had returned. But the house was silent. The next morning, I called the police. They didn't find anything, no forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. They said it was probably just my imagination. But I knew what I heard. Someone had been in the house. For the rest of the weekend, I stayed by my grandmother's side, never letting her out of my sight. But the feeling of being watched never left. Even now, when I think back to that night, I can't shake the image of those boots standing by her bed. The thought that someone was watching her sleep, that they were so close, makes my skin crawl. The worst part is not knowing why they were there or if they might come back. And now, every time I'm alone in the dark, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. I was the only one who saw the start of it all. We live in a house out in the country, far from any neighbors. It was a hot summer night, and we didn't have air conditioning upstairs, so all the windows were open. My window was right above the sliding door leading to our deck. It was around 1 a.m. when our dogs started barking. I didn't think much of it at first since they usually barked at animals outside. But they calmed down quickly, which was unusual. Then, I heard it, a soft, barely noticeable knocking. I froze, terrified. I knew I was the only one awake and had to see what was causing it, but I didn't want to. Then came another faint knock. I knew I had no choice, so I looked down and saw a man. A very tall, strong man wearing a trench coat. He wasn't knocking with his hand, but with something he was holding. I quietly made my way to my mom's room to wake her up, and then to my dad's room. My parents sleep in different rooms due to their differing sleep patterns, but they're happy together, so don't judge. It was difficult to wake him since he sleeps deeply, but I didn't want to make any noise that would alert the man outside. My dad's room is also near the deck, so he looked out and saw the man. Now, the man was shaking the door handle, trying to get in quietly but forcefully. Dad grabbed something to protect himself. We all headed downstairs, with Mom and me following closely behind him. When the man saw us ready to defend ourselves, he stepped back, looking surprised. Dad spoke to him through the window, asking why he was there, what he wanted, and saying he had a weapon and had already called the police. The man started stammering, pretending to be drunk and claiming he needed a ride home. My dad replied with a line I'll never forget, because it was so spot on. I don't buy it. Who wears a trench coat in the middle of summer if they're just drunk? The man saw the police car arriving and bolted across the field. They later found a machete near the deck. One of the most terrifying experiences I had while being home alone happened during one of the first times I was left by myself as a teenager. I was home alone on a random Saturday when my parents took my sister to some event. I was enjoying the freedom, and everything was going smoothly until I decided to leave the house to visit a friend. My parents had specifically told me not to go out, but I didn't listen. In the moment, I left without locking the door, completely forgetting about it. I returned a few hours later with a terrible gut feeling. Something felt off, and I noticed that cabinets were open and things were scattered around the house. I began to panic but didn't fully believe someone was inside because everything was so quiet. I started shouting around the house to see if anyone was there, but there was no response. I started to feel a bit more at ease until my phone rang. The caller ID was unknown. Out of curiosity, I answered, only to hear deep, heavy breathing on the other end. Fear gripped me. It felt like something straight out of a horror movie. I kept asking, "Who is this?" repeatedly, but the call ended abruptly. 2 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the same unknown number, and once more I heard the deep breathing. This time it sounded angrier. Frustration and fear mixed as I demanded they speak, but the call ended again. I received another call from the same unknown number. The breathing resumed, but then, out of nowhere, a deep, quiet voice whispered, "I'm inside the house." My heart nearly stopped, and chills ran down my spine. I had never been so terrified in my life. But trying to keep calm, I convinced myself it was just a prank call from my friend or maybe my sister, knowing I was home alone. The caller hung up again, but then I heard creaking from upstairs, followed by loud footsteps. Something fell, and I realized someone was sprinting down the stairs. I managed to get a head start and bolted out of the house, disappearing into the woods nearby. I immediately called the police. When the cops arrived, they found the door wide open, but they never found the person who had broken in. I'm just thankful I can share that terrifying story today. This happened over 20 years ago, and I still remember it clearly. I was around 16 at the time. After finishing a late shift at a store, I planned to meet a friend at his place. My friend lived in a trailer on his family's farm, and he had 2 roommates. The place was known for being a party spot. Every weekend, we could blast music, make noise, and have fun without anyone stopping us. His trailer was about 200 yards off a quiet country road, surrounded by trees. When I arrived, no one was home because they were all coming back from a racing event, so I decided to wait for them. I sat on the couch, which was against a wall with a window above it facing the woods. I was facing the TV, and there was another window above it also looking out at the woods. There was only a dirt road in front of the house that led to and from the trailer. I turned on the TV and started watching the late-night news. I thought I heard a knock from the corner of the room above my head. I ignored it at first, but then I heard another knock a few moments later. That got my attention. A few minutes later, I heard 3 clear knocks from the same corner of the room. It sounded like it was coming from outside, but I couldn't be sure. The knocking continued, 3 knocks every couple of minutes, for about half an hour. I was so terrified that I couldn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was before cell phones and all the gadgets we have today. I was alone in the woods with nowhere to go and no one to call for help. Finally, I gathered the courage to get up, run out the front door, jump in my car, and drive away as fast as I could. The next day, I told my friend and his roommates what had happened. To my shock, they said they had experienced the same thing before. They had been at home, just hanging out since it was a work night, and they heard the same knocking. At first, they thought someone was outside the house playing a prank. They both rushed out, one through the front door and the other through a side door, to catch whoever was messing with them, but they found no one. This wasn't the only strange thing that happened at that place, but this was my personal experience. I was deep in the woods of Russia, far from anything I knew. I had been hiking for days, going deeper into the thick forest where the trees seemed to block out the sky. The ground was soft with moss, and everything felt damp and heavy. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine. I didn't have any phone signal, no map, and no idea where I was. I thought I could follow a path, but it had disappeared hours ago. The further I went, the weirder things felt. It was way too quiet. There were no birds, no wind in the trees, not even the usual sounds of animals moving around. Just dead silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, keeping track of every step I took. I kept telling myself it was just in my head, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. As the sun started to go down, I knew I had to find a place to stop for the night. I came across a small open area, the first break in the thick trees I'd seen in hours. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. But I was exhausted, so I set up my tent, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling building in my gut. Night came fast and the temperature dropped. The forest was completely dark, with just the outlines of trees against the night sky. I laid down in my tent, trying to sleep, but every little sound outside seemed louder, like it was getting closer. The leaves rustling felt way too close for comfort. Couldn't sleep. I just laid there, listening, feeling the silence push down on me. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves, then another. Something was moving outside my tent. It wasn't the wind or some random animal. It was too slow, too careful. I held my breath, listening as it walked around my tent. I could hear it brushing against the sides, moving closer to the entrance. My heart was beating so hard it hurt, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps stopped right at the zipper of the tent. There was no noise, just the sound of breathing, slow and steady, like someone standing just inches away from me. I laid there, frozen, not moving a muscle for what felt like hours. After a while, the footsteps slowly moved away, getting quieter until there was nothing but silence again. I stayed awake the entire night, too scared to do anything. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped the tent, expecting to see something or someone waiting for me. But there was nothing, just the cold morning air. That's when I saw the footprints. They were all around the tent, big enough to be from a person, but barefoot, no shoes, just bare feet. They circled my tent, then led back into the thick woods. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking the whole time. I tried to follow the path I thought I had come from, hoping it would lead me out. But the forest didn't seem the same anymore. The trees looked bigger, the woods felt darker, and the quiet was heavier. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't find my way out. Hours passed, then a whole day, but I was still lost in that maze of trees. That's when it hit me. Whatever had been outside my tent that night wasn't just passing by. It had been waiting, watching, and now I was exactly where it wanted me. I kept walking, but the feeling only got worse. The sun was starting to set again. My legs felt like they were giving out, but the trees kept closing in. I looked down at the ground and saw more of those bare footprints, fresh ones, like they had just been made. But there were no sounds. I wasn't alone out there, and I was never going to leave that forest. It already decided that. I've been a ranger for nearly 10 years now, working in some of the most far-out parts of the country. I'm used to long stretches of quiet, hearing the wind in the trees, and catching sight of animals darting through the brush. The deeper you go into the woods, the less you see or hear from people. That's always been my favorite part of the job. Just me and the wilderness. But this time it wasn't the same. About 3 months ago, we got a report of a hiker who went missing deep in a forest that almost no one visits. The trails there aren't kept up much anymore and are only used by serious hikers. When they gave me the case, I wasn't worried at first. People get lost all the time, especially when they go off the trail. But there was something about this one that felt off from the start. The guy had been out there for almost a week before anyone noticed he was missing. The moment I stepped onto the trail, I felt uneasy, like something wasn't right. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just because I was alone. The forest can do that to you sometimes. But the farther I went in, the stronger that feeling got. After 2 days of searching, I found his campsite, or what was left of it. His tent was ripped apart and scattered all over the place. It didn't look like any animal had done it, though. The tier was too clean, not the kind you'd expect from a bear or a mountain lion. His gear was still there too, untouched. It didn't make sense. If it had been an animal, they'd have taken the food, dragged something away. But everything was left like he just disappeared. I radioed in, told them I'd found the site, but no sign of the guy. I decided to keep looking, thinking maybe he wandered off. As the day wore on, the forest around me felt wrong. The usual sounds were gone. No birds, no breeze, just this heavy, crushing silence that made the back of my neck prickle. I kept walking, heading deeper into the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. Night fell and I set up camp. I made a small fire, trying to push away the growing sense of dread. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't shake the idea that something was watching me. It was silly, I knew that, but it felt like there were eyes on me from all sides. At some point, I fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up to the sound of branches snapping nearby. My heart was racing as I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods. But there was nothing there. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But after that, I couldn't sleep again. The next morning, I packed up and kept going. By this point, I was starting to think I'd never find him. Maybe it was just another case where someone wandered too far and got lost for good. I was close to calling it in when I saw it. A small clearing up ahead, near a stream. First, it looked normal. But then I saw something out of place, footprints. Fresh human footprints, leading right toward the water. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. They went straight to the edge of the stream, then stopped. No sign of anyone falling in, no tracks leading away. It was like they just disappeared into thin air. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. But the forest was still so quiet, too quiet. Something was wrong, I could feel it. As I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape just behind the trees. I looked right at it, but there was nothing there. I picked up my pace, trying not to let my mind race. But every few steps, I felt it again. Something was watching me. Something was following me. The air felt thick and heavy, like the trees were pressing in closer, like the forest itself was trying to trap me. I don't scare easily, but by the time I got back to my camp, I was on edge. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just sat by the fire, staring into the dark, waiting for something to come out of the trees. But nothing did. The first light, I packed up and left. I reported the search as a failure. I've done plenty of searches since then, but I've never gone back to that part of the forest. Something is out there, and it's not just a lost hiker or some animal. It's something that doesn't belong, something the forest hides. I don't know what happened to that guy, but I do know one thing: whatever's out there is still watching, still waiting. and I don't think it wants to be found. I didn't think I'd end up deep in the South American forest with my uncle and his friend, Anna. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, something my uncle did all the time. He had this strange need to get far away from the city, and Anna seemed just as into it. I didn't know much about her, but she seemed like she could handle herself. We set up camp far from any road, surrounded by thick trees and a kind of silence that didn't feel right. The trees were so close together that barely any sunlight came through. It wasn't a place I'd choose to be, but I trusted my uncle. He had been here many times before. The first day went by fine. We hiked, gathered wood, and set up camp. It was peaceful, but the air felt strange, like something was off. Maybe it was just me being on edge from being in a place I didn't know. My uncle didn't seem worried, so I tried to let it go. The next day, we decided to hike even deeper into the woods. My uncle wanted to show us a spot he found on another trip. The path wasn't clear, and soon, it seemed like the trail just disappeared. I felt uneasy, but my uncle and Anna stayed calm, so I kept quiet. Hours passed as we moved deeper into the forest. The farther we went, the harder it was to move through the trees. The brush was thick, and we weren't on any trail anymore, just walking straight into the middle of nowhere. The sun started to go down, and I could feel the fear building. I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to seem scared. Finally, we stopped in a small open space, trees towering over us. My uncle said we'd camp there for the night. We set up the tents quickly as the light faded. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. That night felt like it lasted forever. I lay in my tent, listening to the forest. Every little snap of a branch or rustling leaves made my heart race. It had to be animals, I thought. But then I heard something else. Something heavier, moving slowly outside the tent. It wasn't a small animal, it was bigger. The sound stopped right outside my tent, and there was silence for what felt like hours. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I was too scared to look outside. Eventually, the sound faded, and I must have fallen asleep from being so tired. The next morning, I stepped outside, and everything seemed normal. My uncle and Anna were already packing up, but I could see on their faces that they heard it too. No one said anything, but we all knew. It was time to leave. We hiked back in silence. The path we came in on was hard to find, and I started feeling like we were walking in circles. The deeper we went, the more I felt like something was closing in on us. My uncle and Anna were walking faster now, more focused. They seemed to understand that we needed to get out of there, and fast. Hours passed, and I started to wonder if we were lost. The forest around us seemed darker, the trees more twisted than before. The deeper we went, the more I realized my uncle didn't know the way out. He kept stopping, looking around, changing direction. After a while, it became clear we were just wandering with no idea where to go. By the time the sun began to set again, the fear in me was almost unbearable. We had no choice but to set up camp again, deeper in the woods than before. The air felt even heavier, and the forest was quieter than it should have been. The sounds around us had changed. It wasn't just the usual noises of animals anymore. There was something else out there, moving, watching us. That night, it happened again. The noise outside the tent. Heavy footsteps, slow, moving closer and closer. This time, they didn't stop. I heard the zipper on Anna's tent, her hurried steps, and then the loud snap of branches breaking. Then, nothing. Silence. Morning came and Anna was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. My uncle didn't say a word. He just grabbed his things and started walking. I followed, too afraid to ask what had happened. We walked all day without stopping. No breaks, no talking. just walking. The trees seemed to close in on us, and the shadows grew longer as the day went on. It felt like we were never going to get out of there. Finally, we broke through the trees and stumbled onto a dirt road. I've never felt more relieved in my life. But even as we stood there, safe, the weight of the forest stayed with me. We never spoke about Anna or what happened that night, but the look in my uncle's eyes said it all. He knew exactly what had happened, but he wasn't going to say it. Something was out there in the forest with us. Something that knew the woods better than we ever could. And I had a feeling it wasn't done with us yet. We may have made it out, but I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was out there knew where to find us. We were deep in the woods, far from any town or road. The sun was starting to go down, and long shadows stretched through the trees. My legs were sore from walking all day, and the air was thick and sticky, making it feel like I was breathing through a wet towel. I was part of a police team, looking for a dangerous man who had been on the run for weeks. People thought he was hiding out in these woods. There were 4 of us spread out searching the area. The deeper we went, the more the trees seemed to close in on us. The trees were tall and packed close together, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Every noise seemed louder, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and the steady buzz of bugs. We knew the man was armed. The briefing earlier told us he was desperate and violent. He had already killed 2 officers during his escape, and no one knew what he might do if we found him. My nerves were shot. Every now and then, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, but it was always just the wind or some animal. Hours went by, and the daylight was almost gone. The woods were dark now, but we couldn't stop searching. We couldn't let him get away again. I turned on my flashlight, the small beam cutting through the dark, but it only made the shadows feel closer, like they were creeping in on me. Then, out of nowhere, I saw movement ahead. It was more than just the wind this time. I froze and pointed my light in the direction, my heart pounding hard in my chest. For a moment, I thought it was him, but as I got closer, I saw it was a tent, a rough camp set up between a group of thick trees. I crouched down, trying to stay quiet. The tent looked old, like it had been there for a while, but I saw fresh footprints in the dirt. Whoever was here was still close. I scanned the area with my light, but didn't see anyone. The air was so still, that deep, heavy silence that only comes in the woods at night. I moved toward the tent slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I pulled back the flap and found a few things: an old knife, some canned food, and a map. The map had lines all over it, showing trails and spots he might have been planning to go. I stepped back, that strange feeling that I was being watched creeping up on me. That's when I noticed something else. There were no sounds. The woods had gone completely silent. No bugs, no wind, nothing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned around, expecting him to be right behind me. But no one was there. Still, the feeling of being hunted was strong, like I was no longer the one looking for him. He was looking for me. I had to get back to the others, tell them what I found, and regroup. I tried to radio in, but all I got was static. The signal wasn't working this deep in the woods. That sinking feeling hit me hard. I wasn't just searching for a dangerous man anymore. I was the one being chased. I started backing away from the camp, trying to move as quietly as I could. I didn't know where he was, but I knew he had the advantage. He knew these woods better than me. Just as I began to leave, I heard a soft crunch behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping through the trees, but there was no one. My heart was racing, and my whole body felt tight. I moved faster this time, stumbling over roots and branches in the dark. Every noise felt like it was him, getting closer, ready to grab me. No matter how fast I moved, the The feeling of him being right behind me never left. By the time I made it back to the trail where we started, I was covered in sweat, breathing hard. I didn't stop until I was far enough away, back near the vehicles. The others came back eventually, but the fugitive was never found. He was still out there, somewhere in the dark, hiding. It's been weeks now, but I can't stop thinking about those woods. I still feel it sometimes, that feeling of being watched, of knowing someone dangerous was right behind me, just out of sight. I haven't gone back since, but sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment. The worst part? I think he's not just hiding anymore. I think he's watching. Not the woods this time, not some random cop. Watching me. It's been getting harder to sleep, but I keep hearing that sound. A soft crunch of leaves, always just outside my window. I've lived next to Dave and his wife Laura for a while. They were nice enough, but we didn't talk much. Just the usual wave or nod when we saw each other. They seemed to love the outdoors, always walking out into the woods behind our houses. One day, Dave asked me to come with them. I thought, sure, why not? It would be good to get out and walk around. The path we took wasn't one I had seen before. It was narrow and twisted deeper into the trees than I was used to. I wasn't comfortable going so far out, but Dave seemed to know where we were headed. The air felt colder the deeper we went, and the trees got thicker. After a while, the path disappeared altogether, but Dave and Laura kept walking like they knew exactly where they were going. I followed, but I started feeling uneasy. Eventually, we reached a small open space. Nothing really stood out, just trees surrounding us. But something about it felt off. It was way too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there. Dave and Laura walked right up to a big flat rock, like they had been there before. They didn't say anything, just stood there, like they were waiting for something. I stood back, watching them. Their movements seemed strange, like they had done this many times before. That's when I noticed the ground. It didn't look right. The dirt around the rock looked like it had been dug up recently. My stomach started to twist. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad had happened here before. I kept thinking, why would anyone come this far off the trail? What were they doing out here? Dave and Laura just stood there, staring at the ground, waiting. It was creepy, and I decided I had to leave. I made up some reason to go back home. Inside, I was getting really nervous, my heart racing. They didn't stop me, just gave me a nod like they didn't care. The whole walk back, I couldn't stop thinking about that spot. The dug-up ground, the way they were acting. It didn't sit right with me. When I got home, I locked my doors, but I couldn't get the feeling out of my head. The next day, I did something I shouldn't have. I went back alone. I found the clearing again easily, and that same flat rock. I walked up to it, looking around. That's when I saw it. A small shovel, half buried under some leaves, like someone had tried to hide it. The dirt around the rock looked even more messed up, like someone had been digging again. My stomach sank. Then, I smelled something faint, something awful. It was the kind of smell that sticks with you, the smell of death. I didn't think twice. I ran. My legs felt weak, my chest tight, but I didn't stop. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and window. I haven't seen Dave or Laura since that day. Their house has been dark. No movement. Nothing. But at night, I hear strange sounds coming from the woods. I know something's out there, something they were hiding. Last night, I saw a light flickering deep in the trees. It was coming from where that rock is. I don't know who's out there now, but I'm not going to find out. All I know is that whatever they buried didn't stay down. I had been walking for hours, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine trees. The trail seemed endless, and the deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it became. The wind had completely stopped, and there was no sound, no rustling of leaves, nothing. It felt strange, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Then the rain hit out of nowhere. At first, it was just a few drops, but within minutes, it turned into a full downpour. I didn't have a rain jacket, and the trail was already turning into mud. My boots, which had been doing fine up until now, started slipping in the thickening muck. The cold water ran down my neck, and I could feel my skin tightening as the temperature dropped. I looked at my map, but the trail had turned into a mess of rain and trees. There was no sign of anyone else, no other hikers, no sounds of the outside world. It felt like I had wandered off the map into a place no one could reach. My heart started racing. This mountain was bigger than I had thought, and I didn't realize how easy it was to get lost. I kept walking, hoping to find some shelter, but the rain made everything look the same. Wet trees, slippery rocks, muddy ground. I couldn't tell if I was going in circles or moving forward. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, it felt like the woods were closing in on me. I tried to look at the map again, but it was too wet and useless now. I felt my thoughts getting jumbled, but all I could hear was the rain, the trees creaking with the weight of it. Hours passed. I was soaked, freezing, and my clothes clung to my skin. I thought about turning back, but I couldn't even remember which way I had come from. The woods seemed to be pushing in around me, trapping me here. A cold feeling crawled up my spine, and my stomach twisted with panic. I was alone, lost, and I had no idea how to get out. That's when I heard it. A noise coming from behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it sounded too deliberate, too heavy. I froze, trying to listen. The noise came closer. It wasn't an animal, I could tell. It was too heavy, too slow. My heart slammed in my chest as I turned, and that's when I saw it. A figure moving between the trees, just outside the reach of the rain. I stood completely still, not able to move, not able to think. My whole body was frozen with fear, and every part of me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't seem to notice me. It just walked, slowly, deliberately, between the trees, moving deeper into the woods. It wasn't running, it wasn't hurrying, just walking. I should have run, but I couldn't. I just stood there, watching, my breath caught in my throat. Then, just like that, it was gone. Vanished. No sound, no movement, just the steady beat of the rain. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but everything was silent again. My heart was still pounding, and the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Slowly, I started moving, still feeling the eyes on my back, but I didn't turn around. I walked for what felt like hours more, the rain still falling, but nothing else moved in the woods. Eventually, I saw a small clearing ahead. I staggered into it, and there, in the middle of the clearing, was a cabin. It was old, the roof sagging and the windows boarded up, but it was shelter. I approached slowly, uncertain if it was safe, but at that point, I didn't care. I needed to get out of the rain. The door creaked open easily, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the air was stale but dry. I collapsed on the floor, too tired to move, shivering from the cold. I didn't want to go outside again, so I stayed there watching the door, listening. The rain continued to beat on the roof, but the silence of the woods around the cabin was unnerving. I didn't dare open the door again, not even to peek outside. I kept my senses sharp, my mind racing, but nothing happened. I waited there, the night stretching on, too scared to fall asleep. By morning, the rain had stopped. The woods outside were quiet, too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I left the cabin, moving slowly, still on edge. As I walked back down the trail, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, quick and fleeting, but I couldn't be sure. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the trees swaying in the wind. When I finally found the main trail again, I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like I was alone. The whole time, as I walked back down, the woods felt like they were watching me, waiting. By the time I reached the base of the mountain, I saw a group of hikers, and for a brief moment I felt relief. But that feeling didn't last. As I got into my car and started driving away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, anything. But the road behind me was empty. The woods were still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following me. Maybe it was still watching me, even now as I drove away. Some things in those woods should never be found. And some places you should never go back to. I was about 12 years old when my dad took me on a weekend trip to my grandparents' cabin deep in the woods. We'd been there before, but this time it felt different. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the ground was soft and wet from the rain, making a squishy sound under our boots. Dad and I were the only ones at the cabin this weekend. My grandparents were away for a few days, so it was just the two of us, alone in that quiet, faraway place. The cabin was old with floors that creaked and windows that didn't shut all the way. But I didn't mind. It felt peaceful, like we were cut off from the rest of the world. We spent the first part of the day walking along a small trail my grandfather had marked a long time ago. The sun was beginning to set when we reached a small clearing. It wasn't until the shadows between the trees grew longer that I started feeling uneasy. I didn't know why at first, but something about the growing dark made the woods feel heavy. Then I heard it, just a rustling in the bushes behind us. It wasn't the usual sounds you hear in the woods. No birds or squirrels, just a slow, steady movement. It felt like something big was following us, moving just off the trail. I looked up at Dad, but he kept walking, unaware. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder a few times, but I didn't see anything. Still, that rustling kept going. Closer and closer. We walked on, and my nerves kept growing. Finally, we reached the clearing where we planned to rest. The quiet of the woods felt off, like the air itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the wind or some animal, but the rustling didn't stop. It seemed to be waiting for us. We decided to head back to the cabin, but something still felt wrong. As we walked back through the trees, I looked to my left and caught a glimpse of something. A figure standing between the trees, barely visible in the fading light. I froze. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My stomach twisted, a feeling of dread sinking into my bones. We kept walking, my heart pounding hard in my chest. I kept my eyes on the ground, trying not to look back at whatever I'd seen. As we neared the cabin, the feeling of silence around us pressed down even harder. Everything felt wrong, like we were being watched. Dad didn't seem to notice anything. He just walked ahead, not a care in the world. Dad went inside the cabin to start the fire. I stayed outside for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling, but the woods felt too quiet. I felt something lurking just outside my view. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The same rustling, but this time it was louder, like something big was moving through the brush. I felt my heart drop. The air around me seemed thicker, like it was pressing in on me. I turned quickly toward the woods, hoping it was just my imagination. But no. Standing just outside the trees, clearly visible now, was the same figure I had seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. My legs felt frozen in place, too scared to move. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, The figure stepped back into the darkness of the trees and disappeared. Couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was run inside the cabin as fast as I could, locking the door behind me. Dad was sitting by the fire, completely unaware of what had just happened. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, just waiting. Even with the door locked and the fire crackling, it felt like we weren't alone. The next morning, we packed up early and left. We never talked about what happened, but I could tell Dad knew something was off. I didn't want to ask him about it, and I'm pretty sure he didn't want to bring it up either. After that, we never went back to that cabin again. For a long time, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the figure, about the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what it was, but I never felt safe in those woods again. Every time I try to go camping or hiking, I can't shake the feeling that something might be out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. Even now, I can still feel the weight of that silence in the woods, the stillness that wasn't quite right. It's a silence that stays with you long after you've left. There are nights when I wake up, feeling like something's right outside my window, and I can't shake the thought that it's still out there, waiting for me to go back. And maybe, just maybe, it's been following me ever since. I lived next door to a guy named Mark, an Army veteran. He was the quiet type, always busy working on his truck or fixing up his yard. We'd wave at each other when we saw one another, but that was it. I didn't know much about him besides his military background. Everything changed one Saturday morning when I bumped into him as I was getting ready to go hiking. He mentioned he was planning to hike the same trail and asked if I wanted to tag along. It felt rude to say no, and honestly, I thought it might be nice to have someone who knew the outdoors with me. The trail was about an hour's drive away, winding through thick woods and climbing up into some hills. We drove separately but met up in the parking lot and started the hike together. Mark wasn't much of a talker, which was fine by me. We hiked in silence for about an hour, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional bird. The trail was steep and rocky, and the forest around us got denser the higher we went. At one point, Mark stopped suddenly and stared at the trees. His face turned serious. He pointed out a small, almost hidden path that split off from the main trail. I hadn't noticed it at all. He said it looked like a deer trail, but the way he was looking at it made me uneasy. It wasn't just a look of curiosity. It was like he was trying to figure out if something was watching us. We kept walking, but Mark seemed different after that. He was more on edge, scanning the trees, stopping more often to listen. I felt it too, this tension building up. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig, made me jumpy. It didn't feel like just birds or squirrels anymore. After another hour or so, we reached the top of the hill, where the trees opened up to a rocky area with a clear view of the valley below. Mark didn't even look at the view. He kept his eyes on the forest behind us, standing with his back to the edge like he was guarding something. I tried to relax, but it was hard with him so on edge. We didn't stay long at the top. Mark started heading back down at a faster pace, barely stopping to catch his breath. I followed, my nerves wound tight. The forest felt different now, darker, quieter. The sounds of wildlife had faded, leaving an eerie silence behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, following us. When we got back to that hidden trail, Mark suddenly stopped and turned to face it. Without a word, he stepped off the main trail and started down the narrow, overgrown path. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay on the main trail, but I followed him. The deeper we went, the more my unease turned into real fear. This wasn't a deer trail. The ground was packed down, the trees spaced out too evenly like people had been using it recently. After about 10 minutes of pushing through the thick bushes, we came into a small clearing. In the middle was a campsite, a beaten-up tent that looked like it had been there for years, surrounded by some rusty cans and a pile of old ashes from a fire. Mark froze, staring at the campsite with a look that sent chills down my spine. He knelt down and picked up one of the cans, turning it over in his hands before dropping it like it burned him. It wasn't old. It was fresh, the label still clear, and the ashes in the fire pit had been messed with recently. Mark stood up quickly, his eyes darting around the trees. Without warning, he took off back the way we came, not saying a word. I ran after him, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, the trees leaning in, the shadows growing longer. Every step felt like we were being chased, like something was right behind us, just out of sight. We didn't stop running until we were back on the main trail, gasping for breath. Mark didn't slow down until we were almost at the parking lot. Even then, he kept glancing back, his face pale and tight. When we finally got to our cars, Mark didn't say anything. He just got into his truck and sped off, leaving me standing there, confused and rattled. I didn't stick around either. As I drove home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the hike in my mind, trying to figure out what had happened. The next day, I noticed Mark's truck wasn't in his driveway. A few days passed, and it still wasn't there. A week went by, then two, and still no sign of him. One day, I saw a moving truck in front of his house. By the time I got home from work, Mark's house was empty, with a for sale sign out front. I never saw him again. I never found out what we had stumbled across in those woods. But every time I hike that trail, I make sure to stay far away from that hidden path because whatever was out there, whatever scared an army vet like Mark so much, it's still out there waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself thinking about that day. I wonder if Mark was running from something that didn't want to be found. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it knows I saw it too. Maybe that's why, whenever I'm home alone, I get this strange feeling, like I'm not really alone at all. My sister and I had always loved hiking together. We'd been doing it for years, picking different trails every time, always looking for new places to explore. This time, we chose a path that wasn't very popular, hidden away in a quiet part of the mountains. It wasn't on any of the usual hiking sites, which made it perfect for us. We wanted to get away from the usual crowds and enjoy some peace in the wild. The trail started off easy, winding through thick woods with the sun shining through the trees. We laughed and chatted as we walked, enjoying the cool mountain air and the sound of birds around us. The forest was alive with the noises of nature, but the further we went, the quieter it got. After a few hours, the path started to get steeper and more covered in bushes. We had to push through thick plants, and sometimes the trail almost disappeared under our feet. We didn't worry about it, though. We'd been on harder hikes before, and we were sure we could handle it. But as the hours went by, the mood started to change. The woods seemed darker, even though it was still daytime. The trees were so close together that it felt like they were closing in on us. The usual forest sounds were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that made my skin crawl. My sister and I kept moving, but we weren't talking or laughing anymore. We just focused on the trail, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was off. We came to a small open area and decided to take a break. The silence was overwhelming, so we didn't stay long. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something strange. There were no animal tracks anywhere. Usually, you'd see signs of deer, rabbits, or even bears in a place like this, but the ground was untouched, like nothing had lived here for a long time. We kept going, but the trail got more dangerous. The ground was uneven and slippery, and we had to use our hands to keep from falling. It wasn't just the physical effort that was getting to us, though. The air felt thick, almost like it was weighing us down, and I could feel the tension between us. Something was wrong, but neither of us wanted to admit it. As we climbed higher, I started to feel like we were being watched. It wasn't a logical thought, just a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following us, but there was nothing, just the same thick forest, stretching out in every direction. We finally reached the top of a hill, hoping to see the area around us and figure out where we were. But when we looked out, all we saw was more forest. It was just a sea of trees, with no sign of the trail or anything that would help us find our way. It was like we were completely cut off from the rest of the world. That's when I realized how lost we were. The trail had been hard to follow, and we'd made so many twists and turns that I had no idea which way we had come from. My sister must have realized it too, because she gave me a look that showed she was just as scared as I was. We decided to try and go back the way we came, hoping to find something familiar. But as we started walking, everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, even the patches of bushes, they all blended together in a confusing pattern. It was like the forest was playing tricks on us, pulling us deeper into its heart. Hours went by, and the sun began to set. The light was fading fast, and the temperature was dropping. We didn't have the gear to spend the night out here, and the thought of being stuck in these woods after dark was terrifying. We started walking faster, desperately trying to find our way out. Just when it felt like we were making progress, I noticed something up ahead. Our backpacks, lying on the ground in the same clearing where we'd stopped earlier. We had walked in a circle. Panic hit us hard as we realized that we were trapped in this forest, unable to find our way out. The shadows grew longer, and the air turned freezing cold. My sister and I huddled together, knowing we had no choice but to keep moving, even as the darkness closed in around us. We walked through the night, exhausted and scared out of our minds. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a branch sent waves of fear through us. But it wasn't until early the next morning that we saw something that made my blood run cold. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we came across another clearing. In the middle of it, there was a pile of rocks, arranged in a circle. They were too neatly stacked to be natural, and something about them felt wrong, almost threatening. What sent a chill down my spine was the realization that we hadn't seen this clearing before. It wasn't just that we were lost. It was like the forest itself was changing, leading us in circles, and now showing us this disturbing sight. My sister and I exchanged a glance, our fear now clear as day. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just us getting lost. The forest didn't want us to leave. We were caught in a place that was playing with us, twisting the paths, shifting the landscape. And I knew, deep down, that the longer we stayed, the harder it would be to ever find our way out. The forest wasn't just a backdrop to our hike. It was alive, and it was toying with us, trapping us in its depths, with no way out. The thought settled in my mind like a heavy weight, chilling me to the bone. We might never make it out. I was excited for my solo hike through the old forest near my grandmother's house. It was a quiet, hidden spot that I'd walked many times before, but today felt different. The woods were eerily still, as if they were holding their breath. As I walked the usual trail, I noticed the thick bushes seemed even denser than usual, making it hard to see far ahead. About an hour into my hike, I came across something strange. A small, carefully arranged pile of stones and sticks right in the middle of the path. It felt out of place, almost like it was intentionally set there. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be a prank or the work of another hiker, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept looking around, and the forest seemed to close in on me, with shadows moving just out of sight. It felt as if the trees themselves were watching me. After another hour, I decided it was time to head back. I was starting to feel anxious, and the once familiar trail now felt like a confusing maze. As I turned around, I saw the same pile of stones and sticks on the path again. It looked like it had been moved from where I had first seen it. My heart pounded. I knew I hadn't passed it twice. I picked up the pace, my breathing quick and shallow. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. It wasn't just the forest that was making me nervous. It was the thought that someone, or something, might be following me. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I felt a wave of relief seeing the open field of my grandmother's property. I had just started to calm down when I noticed a figure on the porch, an old woman with a familiar face. It was my grandmother watching me intently. I walked up to her, shaking, and she asked about the hike. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just nodded, looking at me strangely. Later that night, while we were preparing dinner, she casually mentioned that she'd heard about someone trying to build a small shelter in the woods recently. She said it was probably just a local with odd habits, but it didn't sound like something to worry about. That night, as I lay in bed, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I kept the lights on and checked all the doors and windows several times. The calm of the evening felt like it could shatter at any moment. When I got back to the city and looked through my phone's gallery, I found a photo I'd taken by accident during the hike. In the background, slightly blurry, was a figure standing behind a tree. I hadn't seen it while taking the photo, and it was hard to make out details, but the presence was clear. The next time I hiked there, I stayed on the main paths and avoided the area where I'd seen the stones. I kept a watchful eye, but I never saw the figure again. However, the unsettling memory of that day never left me. The forest remained a place of quiet terror. Each time I passed by, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still out there, watching me from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to make its presence known again. The thought that I might not have been alone all along was the most chilling of all. I was hiking alone in an area that a friend had once told me about. The trail wasn't marked clearly, but I had a map and a GPS, so I felt pretty sure I could handle it. The place was mostly untouched, with thick forests and a few open fields here and there. The weather was perfect, and the fresh air felt great. As the sun started to go down, I decided it was time to find a place to set up camp. I found a small clearing that looked just right: flat ground, trees to block the wind, and a small stream nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and made a small fire to cook my dinner. Everything felt calm, and I was looking forward to a quiet night under the stars. After eating, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. The night was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I felt a sense of peace, knowing I was miles away from anyone else, deep in the woods. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what woke me up at first, but then I noticed something strange. The air felt thick, and there was a strange smell, like wet dirt mixed with something metallic. My first thought was that it was just the forest, maybe some animal nearby, but the smell was stronger than anything I'd ever come across before. It was making me feel uneasy. I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. A faint, steady sound, like footsteps, but slower and more careful. I stayed still, listening closely. The sound seemed to be coming from outside my tent, moving around it slowly. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too heavy for that. My heart started to pound, and I could feel my hands sweating. I waited, trying not to make any noise, hoping that whatever it was would go away. But the footsteps kept circling, slow and steady, getting closer to my tent. The smell was stronger now, almost making me feel sick. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, every part of me screaming that something was very wrong. Then the sound stopped right outside the tent. I could feel something there, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I didn't dare move or breathe too loudly. The silence was crushing, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After what felt like forever, I heard the sound of something being dragged across the ground, like something heavy being pulled away from the tent. I stayed in my tent, frozen with fear, until the first light of dawn. When I finally forced myself to step outside, the clearing was quiet, the smell was gone, and everything looked normal except for one thing. About 20 feet from my tent, the ground was messed up, like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt and leaves. The trail led into the forest, disappearing into the thick bushes. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, not caring about breakfast or even the fire. I just wanted to get out of there. As I rushed down the trail, I kept looking back, half expecting to see something following me. The forest was strangely quiet, like it was hiding something. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, my heart still racing. I never figured out what was out there that night, but whatever it was real. There was no trick of the mind, no imagining things. I've hiked in many remote places since then, but I've never gone back to that trail. Some places are better left alone. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to come too close. I decided to go on a solo hike along a trail I'd never tried before. The weather was perfect, and the trail was known to be tough but with great views. I packed light, just some water, snacks, and a small first aid kit. The trail started off easy, winding through thick trees and clearings where I could see the mountains in the distance. As I kept going, the path got steeper, and the trees grew closer together. The trail markers that had been easy to spot earlier started getting harder to find, but I felt sure I could keep track of where I was going. After about an hour, I reached a split in the trail. There were no signs to show which way to go. One path looked well worn, while the other was barely visible, covered in bushes and weeds. I chose the overgrown path, thinking it might be a shortcut. The trail quickly got rough. Tree roots and rocks stuck out, making it hard to walk without tripping. I had to push through thick bushes that scratched at my arms and legs. I noticed that it was getting harder to see the sky through the trees, and everything around me felt darker. The air seemed different too, heavier, and I realized that I hadn't heard any birds or seen any animals for a while. It was as if the forest had gone completely silent. After what seemed like another hour, I started to worry that I had made a mistake. The trail had disappeared, swallowed up by the forest. I looked around and realized I couldn't recognize anything. My sense of direction was totally messed up, and panic began to set in. I decided to turn back, but after walking for a few minutes, nothing looked familiar. It was as if the trees had moved, twisting the landscape into something I couldn't recognize. I tried to stay calm, but I was starting to sweat even though the air was cool. I began walking faster, hoping to find the main trail again, but it only felt like I was getting deeper into the woods. The sun was going down, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even stranger. Suddenly, I stumbled into a small clearing with something odd in the middle. It was an old, rotting cabin, barely standing, hidden deep in the woods. The wood was falling apart, and the roof had partially collapsed. I didn't want to go near it, but it felt like a sign, a marker that I wasn't the first person to get lost out here. I decided to take a break and think about what to do next. I sat on a fallen log near the cabin, trying to figure out which way to go. That's when I noticed something strange. There were several small mounds in the ground nearby. They were too neat to be natural, more like unmarked graves. My heart started pounding as I tried to shake off the thought, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I saw it. Something shiny sticking out of the dirt near one of the mounds. Curiosity got the best of me and I walked over to it. Kneeling down, I brushed away the dirt to reveal an old, rusted hunting knife. The handle was worn and the blade was dull, but it looked like someone had put it there on purpose. That's when it hit me. This place, this cabin, wasn't just some forgotten building. Someone had been here before, and they had left this knife behind, either as a warning or because they didn't make it out. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't just lost. I was in a place where people vanished, a place where the forest swallowed them whole. I forced myself to get up and start moving again, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. I walked as quickly as I could, not caring about the direction anymore, just trying to get away from that clearing. The light was fading fast, and the forest grew darker with every step. Hours went by, and the panic in my chest was turning into pure exhaustion. I had no idea where I was, and the night was closing in. My legs felt like lead, and I stumbled often, but I kept pushing forward. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw a faint light ahead. Hope surged through me, and I pushed forward, crashing through the bushes until I burst out onto the main trail. I was back on the trail, but the fear didn't leave me. I knew I wasn't safe yet. I forced myself to keep walking, following the trail as it wound down the mountain. I didn't stop until I saw the parking lot, my car sitting there in the dim light. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching, still waiting for me to make one wrong move. I had escaped, but just barely. The memory of that cabin, those mounds, and the knife buried in the dirt haunted me. I knew that whatever had happened there, I had come too close to becoming just another part of the woods, swallowed up by the silence that hid something far worse than I could ever explain. And now, even though I'm far away from those woods, I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I step into any forest, I feel that same heavy silence, as if it's waiting for me to let my guard down. I know deep down that one wrong step, and I might never come out again. The forest doesn't forget, and it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. I'd been on a lot of patrols, but this one felt different. We got a call about a hiker who'd been missing for 3 days. I was part of the search team, and our job was to hike deep into the woods to find him. The trail was rough, and the farther we went, the thicker the trees became. The woods were so dense that it felt like they were swallowing up the sunlight. It was eerily quiet, with only the occasional snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes breaking the silence. Every time I tried to listen, though, everything would go quiet again. After hours of hiking, I came across a narrow, old path that looked unused for years. It felt off, but I decided to follow it, hoping it might lead us to the missing hiker. The path brought me to a clearing with an old, run-down cabin. The place seemed deserted, with weeds growing all around and the roof sagging. I moved carefully, shining my flashlight inside. The cabin was empty, but I noticed a few things. A pair of hiking boots near the door, a torn backpack, and a crumpled map on the table. I picked up the map and saw it had several spots marked, one very close to where we were. I decided to check the area around the cabin. When I stepped outside, I noticed something troubling. Fresh footprints leading away from the cabin, but they were uneven, like someone had been stumbling or dragging their feet. I followed the tracks until they suddenly stopped at the edge of a steep ravine. I shined my light down into the dark chasm, but I couldn't see much. The ground around the edge was disturbed, as if something had been dragged or thrown down there. My heart raced, and a cold chill ran down my spine as I thought about what might have happened. I reported what I'd found and waited for the rest of the team to arrive. When they showed up, we carefully searched the area. It didn't take long for one of the team members to spot something further down the ravine. an area that looked like it had been recently disturbed. Using ropes, we made our way down and found the missing hiker trapped between some rocks. It was clear he had either fallen or been thrown, and the signs showed he didn't survive long after the fall. The torn backpack and map were his, and they showed he had tried to find his way out but couldn't. As the sun set, we gathered our gear and prepared to leave. The woods seemed darker and more oppressive now, and the silence felt heavier. It was a grim reminder of how harsh and dangerous the wilderness can be. We had found the missing hiker, but the forest had claimed its price. Back at the station, the reality of the situation hit me hard. It was a chilling reminder that even familiar places can hide deadly dangers. No matter how careful you are, sometimes the wild has its own way of taking what it wants. As I reviewed the case, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister out there, lurking in the shadows of the woods, waiting for its next chance. I decided to go hiking with my father-in-law one weekend. He was always on the move and loved talking about the hikes he used to take when he was younger. I thought it would be a good way to bond and maybe impress him a bit. We picked a trail deep in the mountains, known for its tough terrain and stunning views. The trail started off easy, with wide paths and a gentle slope. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was fresh. We walked in silence, our boots crunching on the gravel. As we went deeper into the mountains, the path narrowed, and the trees got thicker. The sunlight turned into just a few rays peeking through the trees. The air got colder, and the silence around us felt heavier. After a few hours, the trail began to climb steeply. The trees became fewer, and the ground was rocky, making each step feel unstable. We kept going, but I could feel the strain in my legs. My father-in-law, despite being older, handled it with ease, hardly slowing down. I pushed myself to keep up, not wanting to seem weak. Eventually, the trail led us to a ridge with a steep drop on one side. The path was barely wide enough for one person to walk comfortably. Below, the valley stretched out, looking tiny and far away. The wind picked up, making it harder to keep my balance. I focused on each step, trying not to slip. As we walked along the ridge, I noticed the ground felt loose. Small rocks kept sliding down the slope with each step. It made me nervous, but I stayed quiet. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, trying to keep up with my father-in-law. The ridge seemed endless, with each step making the drop below feel more menacing. Suddenly, I heard a sound like something shifting under my feet. I froze, feeling the ground give way. A section of the trail crumbled and fell away, taking my footing with it. I dropped to my hands and knees, gripping the dirt with my fingers. My heart pounded as I realized how close I was to falling off the edge. I managed to pull myself back onto the narrow path, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. My father-in-law was a few steps ahead, unaware of what had just happened. I got back on my feet, forcing myself to keep moving, but each step felt like a gamble now. The ridge continued, and so did the loose ground beneath us. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trail started to widen again. The ridge dropped away, and we were back on more solid ground. The relief I felt was intense, but it didn't last long. I looked back at the ridge we had just crossed, realizing how narrow and dangerous it really was. The thought of how close I had come to a serious fall was chilling. As we made our way down the mountain, the reality of what could have happened weighed heavily on me. My father-in-law walked ahead, seemingly unaffected, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had pushed myself too far. I understood then that nature doesn't care how ready or determined you are. One wrong step, one moment of bad luck, and it could all end in an instant. By late afternoon, we reached the bottom of the trail. I looked back at the mountain, the ridge now just a thin line in the distance. I didn't say anything, but the experience had a lasting impact. I learned that the mountains are not just beautiful but also perilous, and no amount of confidence or experience can protect you from their dangers. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind kept replaying the moment when the ground gave way beneath me. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to slipping off that ridge. I wondered how easily it could have been my last hike. The thought that my life could have ended in such a brutal way, falling into that abyss, kept me awake. The next morning, the weight of that near-death experience still hung over me, and I knew it was something that would haunt me for a long time. For context, I am a seasoned wilderness explorer. Since I was a kid, my passion has always been focused on nature. I've trekked through rugged terrain in many parts of the world. I know the wilderness like it's a close friend. I always research the wildlife in the area before heading out, so I know what to expect. That's what makes this experience so unsettling. One day, while browsing a travel site for a hike in West Virginia, I noticed an ad for a particular mountain trail. Again, nothing seemed unusual during my research, and it appeared to be the perfect hiking spot, leading to a stunning view of a bright blue lake. In my research, I found that the area was very remote, with the closest town being over 100 miles away. That made it even more appealing. The region had the usual plants and animals, nothing out of the ordinary. There was a note advising hikers not to disturb the wildlife and to be cautious of unstable ground that could give way, leading to a fall down the mountainside. Overall, it seemed like a typical mountain trail. I spent about a month getting ready for this trip. I made sure to tell everyone I knew where I was going, just in case something happened. Then I drove to the trailhead and began my hike. When I arrived, I marveled at the beauty around me. The start of the trail offered a view of many peaks looming above, and I thought to myself how the scene looked like massive beings standing over the earth. Then I began my hike. First, everything was normal. It was just another mountain trail. I made sure to take a break every 15 minutes or so to avoid exhausting myself. It was around my fifth break that things began to feel strange. The birds had stopped singing, and I couldn't hear any insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving through the trees. It was as if everything had disappeared. After about 5 minutes, I resumed my hike. I was a bit on edge because I was the only sound in the forest. It felt wrong, as though something was watching me, some dark presence toying with me. I continued until I reached my 20th break. I stopped, took out my water bottle, and as I raised it to my lips, I noticed something wasn't right. I heard twigs snapping about 10 feet behind me. I dropped my water bottle and turned around to see what made the noise. I can't fully describe what I saw. It's hard to put into words. The creature was vaguely human-like, standing on 2 legs with pale, almost chalky skin. But its face was far from human. It had eyes that were far too large for its face. Its face, though small, seemed to be overwhelmed by its oversized eyes. The creature's mouth was beyond description, but the closest I can compare it to is a mix between a human and a dog's mouth, with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Its hands were unnaturally large, nearly the length of my arm, with long, thin fingers. As for the rest of its body, I can't clearly describe it. It was almost blurry, hard to focus on. That's all I remember about its lower half. I froze, staring at the creature. It hadn't noticed me yet, but I knew it wouldn't be long. Just then, I sneezed, and the creature noticed me. It turned its head towards me, but instead of attacking, it spoke. "Anigie," it said in a low, guttural tone. "I don't understand," I replied, shocked that it could speak. It looked at me, then leaned forward as if to say, "Go!" I turned and ran, fleeing in terror. I made sure it wasn't following me, and I ran until I reached my car. I recently tried to find information about the creature, but I haven't come across anything. What I do know is that it spoke in Cherokee, told me to leave. After researching the area, I discovered that many people have gone missing there. I now think about the sadness in that creature's eyes, and I believe I know why it wanted me gone. I once camped out in a remote area near the border of Colorado and Utah. I was traveling across the country, sleeping in the back of my truck or in a teepee-style tent I had purchased online. One night, I set up my tent in a deserted camping spot, about 15 to 20 miles from the nearest highway. There was only one other vehicle in the area, and they were far enough away that it was quiet and peaceful. I fell asleep but woke up later to some strange noises on the tent. It sounded like something was being dragged along the nylon, as if someone was walking around the tent, lightly brushing against it. I stayed completely still, listening to the sound of something scraping the fabric without moving a muscle. After what felt like an eternity, maybe 10 minutes, the noises stopped. I continued lying there, listening for another 15 minutes or so, when suddenly my tent collapsed on top of me and my cot. A small support pole had bent, causing the tent to tilt at a 45-degree angle, but I was still able to reach the opening. I quickly unzipped the tent, dashed to my truck, climbed inside, locked the topper from within, and grabbed my gun. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, waiting for the sun to rise so I could go back to collect my tent, stove, and cot. At dawn, I returned to the campsite to see if I was just overly tired and imagining things, or if someone had actually been there in the middle of the night. In the dirt around my tent, there were footprints circling it. The prints were a different size than mine, and they looked like they were made by a pointed cowboy boot. The person had walked around my tent several times before wandering off into the valley. I've never returned to that spot and still get uneasy every time I go camping in a tent. This happened during one of my first solo backpacking trips in the springtime mountains of southern Nevada. I planned to hike up Mount Charleston over 2 days, spending the night, then reaching the peak and descending the following day. If you haven't been there, the trail is beautiful. It winds around the edge of a large valley before leading up to the summit ridge, offering stunning views. About 2 miles into the climb, a faster hiker passed me. Instead of just nodding and continuing on, he stopped and kept pace with me, and we started chatting. Nothing was particularly strange about the conversation, but there was something just a little off about him. He was too intense, too friendly. His charm felt almost manic. It reminded me of that interview with Tom Cruise where he talks about Scientology. This guy was like that, the same kind of forced friendliness. He was too much of a go-getter, too slick, almost as if he was pretending to have a real reaction. I remember him telling me that he really enjoyed pushing his limits, but was frustrated because nothing really felt challenging or exciting anymore. Nothing really got him going like it used to paraphrase. Well, this guy's vibe was really unsettling me, so I made an excuse to stop for lunch. The guy kept hiking, and I thought that was the end of it. I had an awesome rest of the day, and as I hiked, he slowly faded from my thoughts. I found a beautiful campsite on a ledge jutting out from the valley wall and settled in for the night. As night fell, as it happens to all of us when we're alone in the wilderness, I started getting seriously jittery. Full on nerves, man. My mind kept flashing back to how strange that guy was, and how he acted like something pretending to be a normal human. To make it worse, I was cowboy camping. Not even the flimsy protection of a tent between me and the possibility of encountering Mr. Smiley. So, to calm my anxious mind before going to bed, I placed my fixed-blade knife within easy reach, right next to my head. I eventually fell asleep after listening to a few episodes of Mike Duncan's The History of Rome podcast. I slept unusually well, not waking up once the entire night. When I woke up in the morning, I felt surprisingly content and well-rested. That is, until I went to grab my stove out of my pack. The location of my pack wasn't the issue. It was right where I had left it, leaning against a tree about 5 feet from my sleeping pad. No, what really freaked me out was that every single pocket was open. All the zippers were unzipped. All the snap closures were undone. The sleeping bag compartment was open. The interior mesh pockets were open. The buckle closures on my stuff sacks were unbuckled inside the bag. Nothing was missing, and the bag hadn't been moved. But literally every pocket was open. I freaked out, man. I had made sure they were all closed the night before. I'm meticulous with my gear. Someone had opened them. Panicking, I looked down at where my knife lay on the ground next to my sleeping pad. Sure enough, the snap closure that held it to its sheath had been undone. Let me tell you, I set a record for the fastest descent off that mountain. My wife and I were on our honeymoon in Shenandoah Valley National Park in Virginia back in 2022. We were eager to get a short hike in before the evening, as we had just arrived in the area. We were driving to a trail on Skyline Drive around 6 p.m. in a heavy fog under cloudy skies. We passed a strange-looking, lone man on the road a few hundred yards before the trailhead. I mentioned to my wife how odd he seemed, disheveled, blank expression, etc. We hiked about 1.5 miles up the mountain to where the trail met the Appalachian Trail. My wife stopped to pee, and we took a moment to rest before heading back down to our car. Out of the fog, this is true, came the guy we had passed earlier on the road. He was subtly holding one of those combo hatchet/hammer multi-tools at his side. He wasn't just carrying it, it was slightly raised. It gets even creepier. As we walked past him, he mentioned that he had found a set of teeth the last time he was up there. We awkwardly acknowledged what he said, nervous chuckle, and then quickly began heading back down to our vehicle, constantly glancing back to see if he was following us. Once we were about 100 feet away, we started running down the mountain. We would stop every so often to listen and check if he was behind us. It was terrifying. We fortunately made it back to our car, but we were shaken. A few weeks later, we read that someone had been arrested in connection with a murder near that area around the time we were there. We started our hike early, just as the sun was coming up. My stepsister and I wanted to get away for a while, away from all the everyday stress. We chose a trail that wasn't well known, one of those places not many people go. We liked the idea of it being just us and the woods. The first part of the hike was easy. The path was clear, and the trees provided plenty of shade. As the day went on, we talked less and just enjoyed the quiet of the forest. The trail began to climb up a steep hill, and we kept going, eager to reach the viewpoint we had read about online. As we got higher, the trees grew thicker, and the bushes became denser. The trail wasn't as clear anymore. It seemed like no one had walked this way in a long time, but we kept going, thinking we were almost at the top. My stepsister was in front of me, moving confidently through the bushes, but I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavier, and there was this strange silence, like the forest was holding its breath. Then we came across something that made us stop. A big tree had fallen across the trail, its roots ripped from the ground, leaving a deep, dark hole where it had stood. The hole wasn't huge, but it was deep enough that we couldn't see the bottom clearly. Something about it made me feel uncomfortable, like it wasn't just a hole in the ground, but something more. We carefully stepped around it and kept moving. But now, every sound in the forest seemed louder, every shadow darker. We were far from any other people, and the trail was becoming harder to follow. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the path. We knew we needed to turn back soon, but my stepsister was determined to reach the viewpoint. Finally, we got to what we thought was the top, but there was no viewpoint, just more trees and rocks. We were lost. The trail we had been following was gone, swallowed up by the thick forest. I could feel panic rising in my chest, but I didn't want to show it. We decided to head back the way we came, trying to find the trail again. As we retraced our steps, we realized the forest looked different now. The fallen tree with the hole was nowhere to be found, and neither was the trail. We were surrounded by nothing but trees, and everything looked the same. My stepsister started walking faster, trying to find something familiar, but the more we walked, the more lost we became. The sun was setting quickly, and the light was fading. We kept moving, hoping to find the trail or some kind of landmark, but it felt like we were walking in circles. The air was getting colder, and the sounds of the forest grew louder, like the woods were closing in on us. Suddenly, my stepsister tripped over something and fell. When I helped her up, we saw what she had tripped over. A pile of rocks, carefully arranged in a circle. It wasn't something that would happen on its own. Someone had been here before us, but instead of feeling relieved, it felt like a warning. We didn't speak, just kept moving, more desperate now. The forest was darker than it should have been. The silence that had once felt calming now felt heavy, like the woods were watching us. We stumbled through the bushes, branches scratching at our arms and faces, until we finally saw something through the trees. A clearing. We broke through the trees and into the clearing, but what we saw made my blood run cold. In the middle of the clearing was that same hole, the one with the fallen tree, but there was no tree now, just the dark hole in the ground, and beside it, another pile of rocks, this one much larger. It didn't make sense. We had walked in the opposite direction, and yet here we were back at the same place. The realization hit us hard. We were trapped, going in circles, or maybe worse, being led back here by something we couldn't see. I looked at my stepsister, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes that matched my own. We didn't have much daylight left, and we knew we couldn't stay here. But no matter which way we went, we kept ending up back at that hole, like the forest was playing tricks on us. We walked until we couldn't walk anymore, until the darkness was so thick we could barely see each other. Finally, we collapsed near the hole, too exhausted to keep moving. The night was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. In the pitch black, I could hear my stepsister's breathing, quick and shallow. The ground beneath us was cold and hard, and the woods felt alive, watching us, waiting. I knew we were truly lost, not just in the forest, but in something deeper, something we couldn't understand. And as I closed my eyes, trying to rest, the only thing I could think about was that dark, endless hole and what might be at the bottom of it. That night, we stayed there, if you could call it staying. We didn't sleep. We were too scared, too cold, too aware of everything around us. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a branch sent a shiver down my spine. But the hole was the worst. It was like it was calling to us, pulling us in with a force we couldn't resist. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The forest was still the same, the hole still there, and we were still trapped. The sun barely broke through the trees, casting weak light on the ground. We tried again to find the trail, to get out, but it was useless. The forest wouldn't let us go. By the time the sun started to set again, we were back at the hole, as if it had been waiting for us all along. And that's when we knew we weren't getting out. The forest wasn't just lost. It was alive, and it had chosen us. As darkness fell once more, I realized that we were just two more lost hikers, another story for those who dared to walk this path. And in that moment, staring into the blackness of the hole, I knew it wasn't just a place in the ground. It was a grave, waiting to swallow us whole, and no one would ever find us again. I'd been hiking the same trails near my house for a long time, so when my neighbor Paul suggested we try a new one farther out, I thought it would be a nice change. He said he'd heard about a path with great views, but it wasn't on any map. It sounded like a fun adventure, and I was up for it. We started early in the morning. At first, the trail was easy to follow, winding through thick woods. The air was cool, and everything seemed normal. After about an hour, the path started to get narrower, and the trees got closer together. The bushes were overgrown, and it was clear that not many people used this trail. Paul was ahead of me, walking like he knew where he was going, but I wasn't so sure. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, slowly disappeared, leaving only an eerie silence. We came across an old wooden sign, almost too faded to read, pointing deeper into the woods. Paul didn't think twice and kept going. I followed, though something didn't feel right. The trail got rougher, almost disappearing in some spots. We had to push through branches and step over fallen trees. It was tiring, and I started to lose track of time. After a while, Paul stopped and looked around. The trail was completely gone. There was nothing but trees in every direction. I looked back, but the way we came was just as overgrown, making it hard to figure out which way to go. Paul didn't seem worried and kept moving forward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were lost. We kept walking, hoping to find any sign of the trail again. My legs were aching, and I started to feel dizzy from the effort. The trees were so thick now that the sunlight barely reached the ground. We hadn't seen a clearing or anything that looked familiar for hours. The forest seemed to go on forever. Eventually, Paul stopped again, this time with a confused look on his face. He mumbled something about going back, but the way back looked just as confusing. I knew we were in trouble. The uneasy feeling that had been building up all day turned into fear. We tried to retrace our steps, but everything looked the same. Endless trees and thick bushes. It felt like the forest was closing in on us. I could feel sweat on my back, even though the air was cool. We kept moving, but every direction felt wrong. I noticed Paul was moving slower now, his confidence gone. We were just wandering aimlessly. As the sun began to set, we found ourselves in a small open space. I didn't want to stop, but the darkness was coming fast, and without a trail, it was too dangerous to keep moving. Paul started gathering some branches to make a fire, but I could tell he was as scared as I was. We hadn't brought enough supplies for a night out here, just a few snacks and some water. The night in the forest was pitch black. The fire gave us some light, but it barely cut through the darkness surrounding us. I couldn't stop thinking about how we had no idea where we were or how we'd get out. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, but it was just the wind or small animals. At least that's what I kept telling myself. We didn't sleep much that night. The fire went out sometime after midnight, and I was too afraid to close my eyes. The forest seemed different in the dark, more threatening, more alive. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving in the distance, but it never came closer. By morning, we were exhausted, but we had to keep moving. The problem was we still didn't know which way to go. We wandered around for hours, hunger and thirst making it harder to think. The fear of never getting out started to creep into my mind. Paul wasn't saying much anymore, just staring straight ahead as we walked. Then, out of nowhere, we stumbled upon an old cabin, half hidden by the trees. It looked abandoned, with the roof caving in and the windows broken. It wasn't much, but it was something. We approached it carefully, hoping to find anything that could help us. A map, supplies, anything. The inside was worse than the outside, dusty with rotting wood, and a smell that made me feel sick. But on the table, I saw a stack of old maps. Most were too damaged to read, but one was in decent shape. It didn't show much, just some rough outlines of the area, but there was a path marked that led to a nearby road. It was our best shot. We left the cabin and followed the map as best as we could. It was still slow going, but the fear of being lost forever gave us the strength to keep moving. After what felt like another hour, we heard it, the sound of cars in the distance. I can't describe the relief that washed over me. We pushed through the last bit of bushes and stumbled onto a dirt road. We flagged down the first car we saw, a couple of locals who looked at us like we were crazy. They told us we were miles away from any trail and that we were lucky to have found that road at all. I couldn't agree more. As they drove us back to town, I kept thinking about how close we came to being lost out there for good. The forest wasn't just a place. It felt like it wanted to swallow us whole, to erase any trace that we had ever been there. I've hiked a lot of trails, but I'll never go back to that one. And I'll never forget how easy it is to get lost in a place that doesn't care if you ever find your way out. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sounds of the forest in my head. The creaking trees, the rustling leaves, and that unnerving silence that seemed to stretch on forever. It's a reminder that not every path leads you back to safety. Some places don't want you to leave at all, and sometimes you don't. We were deep in the mountains, just a small group of us on a routine patrol. The ground was rough, but we'd handled worse before. We'd been out for days, pushing through thick forests, climbing steep hills, and crossing cold, fast-moving streams. The job was simple, just scouting, but every step felt heavier as we went on. The deeper we went into the wild, the thicker the trees got. The bushes grew tighter together, making it easy to get lost, even with a map and compass. We kept our direction, but the forest seemed to swallow up every sound, making everything feel closer, more intense. The quiet wasn't calming. It felt like the woods were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Late one afternoon, we found an old trail, almost hidden by the overgrown bushes. It wasn't on any of our maps, but it was a clear path, so we followed it. The trail twisted deeper into the forest, the trees crowding us from both sides. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the dirt. After a few hours, the trail opened up into a small clearing. In the middle was an old, run-down cabin. It was out of place, far from any known paths or villages. The roof sagged, and the wood was dark and wet from years of rain and rot. It looked like no one had been there for a long time, maybe decades. We stopped, feeling uneasy, but there was no reason to avoid it. We decided to check it out, see if there was anything useful inside. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, it was dark, with just a bit of light coming through the small, dirty windows. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled musty, like mold and old wood. There were a few broken pieces of furniture, an old stove, and some rusted tools scattered around. Nothing strange, nothing really worth noting. But as we moved through the cabin, a heavy feeling settled over us again. It wasn't exactly fear, more like a deep sense that something was wrong. One of us noticed a trapdoor in the floor, partly hidden by a rotting rug. We pulled it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. We shined our lights into the basement. It was small, barely enough room to stand, and the walls were lined with shelves full of old, dusty jars. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp. As we looked around, the light caught something sticking out of the ground. A piece of old, frayed rope, half buried in the dirt. Curiosity got the better of us, and we started digging around it. The dirt was loose, and it didn't take long to uncover more. As we dug, we found what looked like old, rotted wooden boards, the remains of a rough box or crate. Inside were bones, human bones, scattered and broken, like someone had hurriedly buried a body and then forgotten about it. We got out of that basement fast, cold sweat running down my back. The sun was setting by the time we were outside, the light fading quickly. The air felt different, colder, like the forest was closing in on us. We decided to move out to get as far from that place as we could before dark. As we tried to retrace our steps, the forest seemed to change. The trail we had followed was harder to find. The landmarks we passed now looked unfamiliar. It felt like the forest was trying to confuse us, to keep us from finding our way out. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, made my nerves jump. Night fell, and we were still moving, the beam of our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to press in closer, the path narrowing until it felt like we were being funneled into something. We pushed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we broke through the trees and found ourselves back on familiar ground. We were out, but the unease stayed. None of us spoke as we made camp, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Couldn't sleep, not really. Every sound, every movement in the dark, made my heart race. The next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to leave the forest behind. But as we moved out, I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see something watching us from the shadows. The woods were still silent as ever, but that feeling, that something had been out there watching, waiting, stayed with me. We reported what we found, but it didn't seem to matter. The forest swallowed it all back up, like it had never been there in the first place. We left those mountains behind, but that feeling, that cold dread, followed me. It still does. Sometimes, late at night, I can still see that cabin in my mind, still smell the damp earth of the basement, still feel the weight of those eyes in the dark, watching, waiting for something. I know I'll never go back there, but it doesn't feel like it matters. That place, those woods, they're not done with me. It's like a part of me never really left. It's still out there, buried under the dirt, trapped in the dark, waiting to be found. And maybe one day it will be. Hiking was always my way of blowing off steam on my days off. After long shifts as a cop, I needed the peace and quiet. So, this time I picked a trail about an hour outside the city. It was a calm place, hardly anyone ever out there. Perfect for being alone. I got there early, parked the car, and set off. The weather was nice and cool, the air felt clean, and the forest was full of the sounds of birds and the wind in the trees. As I got further into the trail, something caught my eye. Footprints in the mud. Fresh ones. That wasn't strange by itself, but something made me stop and take a closer look. They weren't from regular hiking boots or running shoes. They were bare feet. That didn't make any sense way out here. I shook it off and kept going, but it stuck in my mind. The more I walked, the more I noticed those tracks. They stayed along the path, sometimes they'd wander off a bit, but then they'd come back. After about an hour of hiking, the prints stopped altogether. I thought maybe whoever it was had gone off trail and turned back. But as I pushed on, I reached a clearing and saw something that made my stomach turn. It was a small campsite, but it looked like it had been ripped apart. A tent lay torn up, clothes were shredded and tossed around, and there were a few food cans scattered on the ground. Nobody was around, but it was clear someone had left in a hurry. I walked over, keeping my eyes open for anything off. It looked like it had been there for a few days, maybe a week, but not long enough for the weather to completely break it down. As I stood there, a weird feeling crept up on me. Something wasn't right. After working as a cop for so long, I knew when things felt off, and this was one of those times. I scanned the trees around me, one hand resting near my gun, but the forest was still. Too still. It was like the woods had gone quiet all of a sudden. I decided to turn back. I wasn't walking anymore. I was moving faster, trying to shake off the unease crawling over me. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something that made my heart drop. The bare footprints were back, but this time they weren't moving away. They were coming toward me, I stopped, my pulse speeding up. The tracks were fresh, and they weren't mine. Someone was following me. I tried to stay calm and kept walking, but every time I looked back, the prints were closer. I couldn't see anyone, but the tracks were there, and they were getting nearer. I started to feel like I was being watched, hunted even, but no matter how much I scanned the trees, I couldn't see a thing. The peaceful woods now felt like they were pressing in on me, tighter with every step. My mind raced, thinking of every possible explanation. I was a cop. I'd been trained for stuff like this, but out here, alone, with no radio or backup, the training didn't matter. The only thing I could do was keep moving. The parking lot wasn't too far away, maybe 20 minutes if I didn't stop. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound behind me, like something was moving quickly through the brush. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. My heart pounded, and I pushed myself harder than I ever had before, dodging branches and keeping my eyes locked on the trail. I could feel something behind me, closing in, moving faster. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what it was. When I reached the parking lot, I didn't slow down. I sprinted straight to my car, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking, my chest tight from the run. I sat there for a few moments, catching my breath, waiting. I expected something or someone to come out of the woods after me, but nothing did. I started the car and sped out of there as fast as I could, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. I half expected to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave, but there was no one. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I drove back to the city, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. I can't explain what happened. I've tried to make sense of it, but nothing adds up. There's no reason for someone to be out there barefoot, following me like that. But I know what I felt. I know something was out there, and it wasn't just some random hiker. Since that day, I haven't gone hiking alone again. Every time I think about it, I remember those footsteps, getting closer, and the feeling of being chased by something I couldn't see. And what bothers me most is that I never saw who or what it was, but I know it saw me. It was the fall of 1978, and a few of us from college decided to go on a weekend hike in the mountains. The area was known for being beautiful, but not many people went there. We just wanted to do something different, something that would take us away from the busy campus life for a while. The first few miles were calm. The weather was perfect, cool and clear. We walked through thick woods, crossed small streams, and climbed over rocky trails. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't be surprised to see animals, and it felt like the kind of spot where you could easily get lost if you weren't paying attention. But we had a map, and we planned to stick to the trails that were marked. As the day went on, we found a small open spot to camp. The sky was starting to get darker, so we built a small fire and got comfortable. The woods around us were quiet, except for the occasional sound of leaves moving in the wind. It felt like we were the only people for miles. I remember looking out into the trees and feeling how thick the forest was. It was like the trees were pressing in on us, heavy and still. That night, things changed. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It was quiet at first, like branches snapping far away in the woods. I thought it was probably just an animal moving around, but then it happened again, closer this time. A slow, steady crunching sound, like someone stepping carefully through the brush. I stayed still for a minute, just listening, my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just a deer passing by. But then I heard it again, coming from the other side now. It was like something was walking in circles around our camp, moving slowly, almost like it was trying to be sneaky. I didn't want to leave the tent, but my curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the tent flap, stepping out into the night. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, and the only light I had was from my flashlight. I moved it across the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but everything was still. No sound, no movement. For a second, I thought I was just overreacting, letting my imagination get to me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. Right at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards away. There was a shape, a person, standing halfway behind a tree. My flashlight hit him for just a second, and that was enough for me to see a man just standing there watching. My stomach dropped. I froze, staring at him. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He was just standing there. I turned off the flashlight, hoping he hadn't seen me or that he would leave if I stayed still. But he didn't. I stood there for what felt like forever, my eyes trying to make out any movement in the dark. Finally, the man moved. He stepped back, disappearing into the trees. I could hear him walking away, the sound of leaves crunching under his feet as he went deeper into the woods. My heart was beating so fast I could barely think straight, but I knew one thing: we couldn't stay there any longer. The night dragged on, but I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, we packed up as fast as we could and started heading back down the trail. None of us said a word. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again, but the woods were quiet, empty. When we got back to the car, I realized how close we might have come to something bad. There was no reason for anyone else to be up there. No homes, no other campsites, just miles of empty forest. Whoever that man was, he wasn't there by accident. And the way he stood there, watching us, I couldn't get it out of my head. We never spoke about it after that trip. None of us wanted to admit how scared we were or how lucky we had been. But sometimes, late at night when I'm out camping or even just thinking about that weekend, I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach, like something is wrong, like I'm being watched again. I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, maybe waiting, maybe looking for someone else to watch from the shadows, waiting until the next person makes the mistake of camping out in those mountains. And maybe next time they won't be as lucky as we were. We were sent out to search deep in the forest after a man went missing while hiking. The area was thick with trees, and barely any light made it through. They believed he might have wandered into an old military test area, which is why they called us in. The deeper we went, the heavier the air seemed to get, like it was pressing down on us. Our team split up to cover more ground. I headed in one direction by myself. The trail quickly became harder to follow. The trees seemed to grow closer together, and the ground was covered in thick bushes. I kept stepping over roots and ducking under branches as I moved further into the woods. After a few hours, the quiet around me became strange. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dry leaves. I noticed some broken branches, like something had moved through recently. My heart started pounding. I thought maybe I was close to finding the missing hiker. I picked up my pace, watching the ground closely for more signs. Then I saw it, a backpack half covered by leaves. It looked like it hadn't been there long. I bent down to look inside. There were water bottles, a map, and snacks. All things you'd expect someone to carry on a hike, but no sign of the person who owned it. I left the bag and continued on, keeping the spot in mind. As I walked further, something started to feel wrong. The trees all started to look the same, like I was going in circles, even though my compass was showing I was going straight. I felt like someone was watching me, but I hadn't seen anyone else out here. Then I spotted something hanging from a tree up ahead. It was an old trap, the kind hunters use, but it had clearly been there for years. The rope was frayed and falling apart. Something about it bothered me. Why would anyone set traps this far out in the woods? And why leave them here, forgotten? Who had come this deep, and for what reason? A feeling of dread settled in my chest. The forest didn't feel right anymore. It wasn't just the quiet or the fact that I was alone. It was the way everything seemed untouched, like time had stopped here, except for those few signs of recent movement. I kept going, but every step made the air feel heavier, like the forest was closing in on me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. After what felt like hours, I came to a clearing. In the middle stood an old concrete structure, covered in vines. It was hidden so well you wouldn't see it unless you stumbled right into it. It looked abandoned, maybe left behind from the days when the area was used for testing. I walked around it trying to find a way in. Something inside me told me this wasn't just an old building. Something had happened here, something bad. I found a broken door and slipped inside. The walls were cracked, and the place was falling apart, but what hit me first was the smell. It was faint, but I knew it right away. The smell of something dead. I followed the smell down a narrow hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the end, I found a small room. The floor was littered with old bones, scattered and forgotten. Whoever had died here was left behind, with no one to notice. No one had come looking for them. Suddenly, it hit me this wasn't part of the search. This wasn't what we were here to find. This was something else, something hidden, something that no one was supposed to discover. And now I was in the middle of it. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I turned around to leave, but then I heard it. A soft sound from outside the building. A twig snapping underfoot. It wasn't loud, but out here, where everything was dead silent, it felt like thunder. I wasn't alone. I ran out of the building, scanning the trees, looking for movement. Nothing. But I knew something was there, watching me. Whatever was in these woods didn't want to be found. And now, I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I started walking back, faster this time, but it felt like the path had changed. The way out seemed longer than the way in, and the trees felt even thicker. The silence was heavier. It weighed on me like I was being watched every step of the way. When I finally got out of the forest, the team asked if I found anything. I shook my head. There are things in that forest no one is meant to find. But I know one thing for sure, whatever I found wasn't finished with me. I still hear it sometimes. At night, that soft snap of a twig, like something's waiting, just out of sight, ready to finish what it started. And it's only a matter of time before it does. My stepsister and I decided to go hiking one weekend. The trail wasn't too far from home, and we thought it would be an easy way to spend the day. We didn't pack much and left early in the morning. The sky was cloudy, but it didn't look like it was going to rain, so we didn't worry about it. The trail started off easy, wide, and well-marked. We saw a few other hikers at first, but as we kept walking, there were fewer and fewer people around. After a couple of hours, we came to a split in the trail. One path looked well-kept, with a clear walkway, while the other was narrow and looked like it hadn't been used much. Without really talking about it, we took the narrow path. I think we both wanted a little more excitement, something that felt less ordinary. As we walked, the trees got thicker, and the trail became harder to follow. The sun was hidden behind the clouds, and only a little light made it through the branches, making everything look kind of gray. After a while, we realized we hadn't seen anyone else for a long time. The trail markers, which had been easy to spot earlier, were gone. My stepsister and I looked at each other, a little worried, but we didn't say anything. We kept walking, hoping the path would loop back to the main trail. The ground became rocky, and we had to climb over big rocks and push through thorny bushes. The wind started blowing harder, making the trees creak. Between the wind, everything was dead silent except for the sound of leaves crunching under our feet. Hours went by, and the trail got harder to follow. At one point, my stepsister slipped and scraped her leg, and that's when we both admitted we might be lost. We tried to go back the way we came, but everything looked the same. The trees and rocks all blurred together, and there weren't any familiar landmarks to help guide us. The sun started going down and it got colder. We hadn't brought enough food or water for this kind of situation, and the thought of being stuck out here overnight made my stomach turn. We started walking faster, hoping to find some sign of the main trail. That's when we saw it, a small cabin off in the distance. We felt a bit of relief. It looked old and falling apart, but at least it was some kind of shelter. We walked up to the cabin slowly. The door was slightly open, and the windows were cracked. Inside, it was dark and smelled like wet wood. There were old, rusted tools lying around and a rough table in the middle of the room. It didn't look like anyone had been there for a long time. We sat down, trying to catch our breath and think about what to do next. As we sat there, something felt off. It was way too quiet. I looked at my stepsister, and she was staring out the window, her eyes wide. I followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at. Out in the woods, far back between the trees, there was someone standing. I couldn't make out any details, just a tall figure too far away to see clearly. We didn't move. We just watched. They didn't move either. They just stood there, barely visible between the trees. My heart started pounding. I tried to tell myself it was just another hiker, maybe someone else who had gotten lost like us. But as the minutes ticked by, the figure still didn't move. It was like they were watching us. The wind outside started blowing harder, shaking the windows. I looked away for a second, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. A heavy feeling sank into my gut. We both knew we couldn't stay here, but we had no idea where to go. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore, like whoever had been standing out there was waiting for something. We grabbed our things and bolted out of the cabin, running back into the woods. The sun had almost set, and it was getting dark fast. The trail was nearly impossible to see now. We stumbled over rocks and roots, trying to get as far away from the cabin as possible. Every noise made my heart race. Every shadow seemed like it could be the figure we saw. After what felt like forever, we found a small clearing and stopped to catch our breath. My stepsister's face was pale, and I knew mine probably looked just as bad. We didn't say a word, just stood there, listening, hoping we had gotten away from whoever or whatever had been watching us. But as I tried to calm down, something caught my eye on the ground, and my blood ran cold. There were footprints, 2 sets of them. They were fresh, and they were leading in the same direction we had just come from. They weren't ours. Someone had been following us the whole time. We stood frozen, staring at those prints, knowing that someone was still out there. And the worst part was we had no idea how long they had been watching us, or how close they might be right now. I've always liked hiking. Being deep in the woods, far away from everything, brings a kind of peace you can't find anywhere else. Last weekend, I decided to try out a new trail, a couple of hours away from my house. It wasn't one I had heard much about, but it seemed quiet and not too crowded. That's exactly what I wanted, some time alone with nature. At first, the trail was easy, winding through thick trees with a few openings where I could see the mountains far away. The weather was perfect, not too hot or too cold. I was making good time and enjoying how quiet everything was. After a few hours, I noticed the trail wasn't as well kept as it was at the start. The trees were closer together, and the ground was bumpier with rocks and tree roots sticking out of the dirt. I hadn't seen anyone for a while, but that didn't bother me. It just meant I was getting deeper into the woods, and that's what I wanted. But then things started to get weird. First, it was small stuff. A few broken branches here and there, not like they had just fallen, but like something big had walked through. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might have been a deer or something, but the deeper I went, the stranger it felt. The ground had deep marks, like something had been dragged across the trail. I kept walking, but it was hard to stop thinking about it. About an hour later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Just off to the side of the trail, there was an old campsite. It wasn't recent. Everything was old and worn down. The tent was half collapsed, and the gear looked like it had been there for years. But it was more than just an old camp. The tent was ripped open, and clothes were scattered all over the place. It looked like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just some strange coincidence. Maybe someone had camped here long ago and didn't clean up properly. But the more I thought about it, the harder it was to ignore. That's when I realized I didn't feel alone anymore. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, but I heard nothing. No birds, no animals, just complete silence. That's what really made me nervous. You're always supposed to hear something in the woods. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. I decided it was time to turn around, even though I didn't want to admit to myself that I was getting scared. As I headed back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just in my head. I could feel it. Something or someone was out there, staying just out of sight. I tried to keep walking at a normal pace, but the further I went, the worse that feeling got. Every time I heard a twig snap or leaves rustle, my heart would race. What had felt peaceful and calm just a few hours ago now felt like a trap. Then I heard it, something moving in the trees behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Whatever it wasn't small. I told myself to keep walking, but this time I picked up the pace. I tried not to panic, but all I wanted to do was run. The sound didn't stop. Every few minutes, I heard it again, and each time it was closer. It felt like whatever was following me was watching, waiting for the right moment. My legs started to ache from walking so fast, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. Finally, I saw the clearing where I had parked my car. Relief flooded through me, but just as I stepped out of the trees, I heard a loud crash behind me, like something heavy had fallen. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. I practically ran to my car, threw my backpack in the back seat, and sped out of the lot. As I drove away, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see something standing at the edge of the woods, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed all the way to my car. Whatever was out there, it wasn't hunting for food. It wasn't an animal. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure of one thing: it didn't want me there. Now, when I think back on it, I can't help but wonder if anyone else made it off that trail, or if whatever was out there has been keeping people from coming back. Something told me it wasn't done. Not with me. Not with anyone who steps foot in those woods. And I have this nagging feeling that one day, I might hear it again, just outside my window. I've been hiking with my grandmother since I was little. Last week, I decided to take her on a new trail I'd heard about. A pretty easy path through a thick forest. The weather was sunny and clear, and my grandmother seemed really happy as we started out. We walked along the trail for a while, enjoying the sounds of birds and the rustling leaves. The path twisted through the woods, and I noticed it was getting quieter. I thought it was just because we were deep in the forest, but it felt off. My grandmother kept talking about her old hiking adventures, but I was more focused on the strange silence around us. After a few hours, we reached a clearing. It was a strange but perfect spot for a break, an open area surrounded by dense trees. We sat down to rest, and that's when I saw something odd. The trail we had come from seemed to disappear. The forest had closed in behind us, making it look like we were surrounded by a solid wall of trees. I checked my map and compass. The clearing wasn't on our route. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that maybe the map was old. We decided to turn back, but the path we had taken was gone. The forest had become an unrecognizable maze of trees. As the sun began to set, the feeling of unease grew. I thought we might have taken a wrong turn, but no matter which way we tried, the forest seemed to twist and change. My grandmother, though still calm, was slowing down, her energy fading. I knew we needed to get out before it got too dark. With the light fading, I spotted a faint glow through the trees. It was a small, old cabin that wasn't on the map. I didn't know if it was empty or if someone was inside, but it seemed like our only choice. We approached the cabin carefully, and as we got closer, I saw that it was locked, but the window was slightly open. I helped my grandmother through the window and followed her inside. The cabin was empty but relatively clean. We made ourselves as comfortable as we could for the night. I tried to call for help on my phone, but there was no signal. Exhausted, we tried to rest, but sleep was hard with the constant sounds of the forest around us. At dawn, I explored around the cabin and found a small, worn path leading back into the forest. Following it, we came across a large rock formation we had seen earlier. It led us back to the main trail, and with a deep sense of relief, we made our way back to the trailhead. As we finally emerged from the forest, I felt a chill. Even though we were safe, the memory of being lost in that creepy forest lingered. The unsettling feeling stayed with me, like we had been watched the whole time. The forest seemed to have a mind of its own, shifting and changing to trap us. It was as if something out there didn't want us to leave, and the thought that we were being observed by something unseen made my skin crawl. The sun was setting as I started my evening hike. My neighbor, Tom, had told me about this trail and its amazing views, so I decided to check it out. I always liked hiking alone, and this one seemed like it would be peaceful. The path was clear at first, but as I went higher, it got narrower and more overgrown. The trees around me seemed to close in, their branches forming a thick cover above. I wasn't worried. I had a map and a compass, and the trail markers were still visible. An hour in, the light had turned to a soft twilight. I was about to head back when I saw something strange. Fresh footprints. They were bigger than mine and looked like they had been made not long ago. I paused and looked around but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I told myself it was probably just another hiker. I kept going, walking faster as it got darker. The trees now looked like shadows against the dim sky, and the trail markers were harder to see. That's when I heard it. A snapping sound, like someone stepping on a twig, coming from behind me. I stopped and listened, but all I could hear was the rustling of leaves and a distant owl. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the unease. The trail twisted and turned, and soon I found myself in a part of the trail I didn't recognize. I checked my map, feeling a pang of panic. This section wasn't on it. I retraced my steps, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The snapping noise continued, and it was closer now. I forced myself to stay calm and focused on finding the right path. I saw a beam of light ahead. Thinking it was another hiker, I felt a brief sense of relief. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a flashlight. It was a headlamp lying on the ground. My heart pounded as I picked up the headlamp. It was still warm, which meant it had been used recently. I shone it around and saw a dark shape moving quickly between the trees. I turned and ran, following my own tracks back to the trailhead. Each step felt like an eternity. Finally, I made it to the trailhead, gasping for breath. My car was just ahead. I fumbled with my keys and got inside, locking the doors. Looking back, I saw the dark shape emerge from the trees, but it didn't come after me. As I drove home, my mind raced. Who was out there and why were they following me? I didn't know, but the idea that someone, or something, was watching me, hidden in the dark, made my skin crawl. When I finally got home and checked my phone, I saw a notification. A news alert about a recent escapee from a nearby prison. My stomach dropped. If only I had known sooner.